I'm fine.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Chicago Maritime Museum. For those of you who have not met me or are joining at home, I am Madeline Crispell, the museum's curator. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce to you all Bill Derrah. He has been with the museum for a very long time as one of our very valued volunteers. And before I give his proper introduction, I want to plug something else. This weekend is Open House Chicago. Of course, you can go to many different sites all over the city completely for free. The Chicago Maritime Museum is just one of the sites in Bridgeport that will be open for free to the public this weekend. So what I am asking you all to do, if you have a friend, a cousin, a bus driver who has not yet been to the Chicago Maritime Museum, tell them to come for free this weekend. It is a particularly good time to visit because it is the last weekend that our current temporary exhibition, Maritime Midwest Modern, will be on the walls. The photographs that you see framed in this space and the 6 out in the introduction are all coming down on Monday the 20th. However, if you do not want to see the exhibition go, it does not have to. You can take home a piece of it for yourself. We are selling all of the framed prints to help fundraise for the Chicago Maritime Museum. So if you are interested in doing that, come see me after the lecture, or you can come back anytime this weekend. It's something you can do online. I mean, one of the Your Docs is already gone, so you guys probably got to be pretty quick with it if you want to get your favorites. So, like I said, it is my immense pleasure this evening to introduce to you all Bill Derrah. Bill Derrah joined the Chicago Maritime Society as a volunteer more than a decade ago to help with the museum's burgeoning artifact collection. A University of Chicago geography major, Bill also holds a master's degree in history education. More recently, he completed the University of Chicago Artifact Collection Care Certification Program so that he could better address CMM'S collection needs, something I appreciate and sure that you sometimes regret. Bill is also a member of the Chicago Yacht Club's Island Goat Society, having sailed more than 25 Chicago to Mackinac races. Yes, impressive, as will be his presentation this evening, as he will be talking to us about what I know is a fan favorite topic, the Erie Canal, in honor of its 200th anniversary. So join me in welcoming Bill Derrah up to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming here. 200 years, Erie Canal. I mentioned I was going to do this. Actually, they asked me, oh, it's coming up. The anniversary is actually the 26th was the big celebration. And people were like, going to do something about the mules? All right, okay. We got to get it out of our system. There they are. They're cute. They kick. I don't know. So, and of course, the Jolly Boatmen. Yeah. A lot of colorful stuff. Of course, now this is Caleb Bingham. It's a Western boat, but it sort of grabs the feeling of the boatmen and the culture of the guys working on the river and singing and drinking and dancing and drinking and So there we go. We're gonna move along. So the Erie Canal at its time was the largest and most expensive bit of infrastructure that had yet been built in North America. The funding was largely private. It was the state sold bonds, so private people bought them. So this was actually almost the invention of municipal bonds to create the Erie Canal. The Congress passed a law to fund it, and then the President Monroe at the time vetoed it. So, but the joke was on them because it was paid off in less than 10 years. So what that meant was the demand was just that the amount they spent and they got it all back in 10 years. So the pent up demand for this waterway was huge. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Although we'll mention the mules and the boatmen. Oops, what did I hit here? All right. So a little geographical background. We've got that little horseshoe. Anybody want to guess what that is? It's the Niagara Escarpment. So in going back a long time, everything was this flat sedimentary rock, and the Niagara was just one layer of a special kind of limestone called dolomite, where it was the calcium got replaced by magnesium, and it makes it resistant to weathering. It doesn't dissolve like limestone, so it's a lot stronger. When the plate tectonics created the Appalachians, you had the big forces coming in, and what it did in Michigan is it just kind of crumpled it, and it created a big fold. It's called the Michigan Basin. And that lip, when the basin was created and the glaciers came over, it exposed that rim of that fold. And that's why the Niagara, the edge of the Niagara sedimentary layer is cupped up, and it makes that kind of a shape. And the problem is, it's like 300 feet, difference. It's or 280. So it's a formidable barrier to navigating. Once you get to Lake Ontario, you have to go up Niagara Falls to get to Lake Erie. So that was a problem. How do you get into the interior? And that's going to be sort of what we're looking at. So the earliest colonies, we had the French in the St. Lawrence, and we're looking at, say, 1650s-ish. You've got the English in New England and further south, the mid-Atlantic. And then you've got the Dutch in the Hudson. And then the Spanish claimed, everything below the yellow line, but they really didn't develop. They had a colony in Florida. They had some stuff going on in Texas, but it wasn't, and they started working in California, but it was very sparsely populated in 1650. But by 1750s, claims were a little more established. Now, again, it's claims are not like cities and people and stuff. This is just what the Europeans sort of claimed as theirs. So that was the yellow is the Spanish, the blue is the French, and the English had the seaboard, eastern seaboard, and the Hudson Bay area. The French, early on, they had their entrance at the St. Lawrence, and they worked to get, their idea was to try to, that's what LaSalle was sent to do, actually, was to create a series of forts along the Mississippi so that they could control the center of the continent. So the Midwest at that time was sort of organized through a connection from the Mississippi through the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence, which is sort of kept the Midwest in play because you could get there through Canada. It was sort of a difficult process. If I go there, they can't see me on. Yeah. Was there a way of? Oh, is that the cursor either? What you've got is well, we'll just keep going here. Okay, so realistically, there was another group that had quite a bit of agency in the area where the Erie Canal is going to be, and that was anybody want to?
The Six Iroquois.
The Six Nations of the Iroquois, yeah. A very powerful Indian confederacy, and they they actually were a model that the early colonists looked at when they formed the U.S. government. That was, they looked at how they were organized. They were extremely organized and warlike, and they had a relationship with the Dutch in the Hudson Valley, and they weren't happy when the English took over, and they were less happy with the French. And there were quite a few periods where they were at each other's throats. And there were times when the French settlements in the lower St. Lawrence, or I should say the upper St. Lawrence, were almost wiped out in the wars with the Iroquois. They eventually sort of came to terms with each other, but for a long time that was an impediment in traveling. And so there was an upper, and we'll get to that, an upper portage that became more common than going down through the Great Lakes. So here we've got the two, so a map of the drainage. You've got Quebec City and Montreal, and the way you would kind of travel was you could go the lower fork that goes down I think the Richelieu River to Lake Champlain. You've got the down the St. Lawrence to Lake Ontario, and then you've got a series of portages up the Ottawa to the French River, which goes into Lake Huron. So that's how you get to the upper lakes. The lower lakes, you could go through Ontario, and then there were portages around Niagara Falls, but you had to deal with the Iroquois. So if it was a year when they weren't going to kill you, you could do that. LaSalle, before he went down the Mississippi, did explore the Ohio, and it was a period where relations were good with the Iroquois. So the Midwest was, at this time, we were getting connected to the rest of the world through the St. Lawrence. And this is what was driving it. So it was felt, right? It wasn't, they weren't using this, they weren't even using the skin. They were just taking the inner guard hair and making a very tight felt, the inner woolly hair, because, beaver live in really cold water in the north. And so their inner wool is waterproof. It interlocks. The hair all has barbs. And so that allows for like crazy hats. And, Louis XIV figured if he kept his noblemen busy in court and buying silly hats and, ridiculous clothes, they weren't back at their estates plotting to overthrow his government. So one of the ways he controlled them was that. And part of the whole hat culture, you had to get kill all these beaver to make the extravagant hats. So that's what drove a lot of the exploration in North America and trade. So to get the beaver, they were bringing trade goods. Now the Iroquois got very used to the Dutch bringing trade goods. And as beaver got extinct, or the term is extirpated in their local area, you had to keep going further and further into the interior to get more beaver. So the Iroquois started pushing against other Indian tribes to get part of that trade. The way that the goods were brought in and the pelts came out was by canoe. And so at the sort of the peak of the fur trade, they would have 34, 36-foot Voyageur canoes. They could carry maybe 3 or 4 tons, which is quite a bit. Now, the boat you're looking at is actually later. It's a later fur trade painting. The artist, if you can see her, she's in the middle. You can just see her face. She's got a little hat on, right next to the guy with the blue. She was married to one of the guys, I don't know which side. He was a partner in the fur trade company, and she sketched. And that's, so this boat was very light on cargo and very heavy on manpower, because this was basically, they were touring the facilities. So they had a crack crew that was going to get them there fast. they wouldn't have normally, if you're just moving 3 tons of goods, you're not going to put that many guys in the boat. You'd probably have like 6 guys. So anyway, but you can move high quality, expensive stuff. If you had to move lumber or corn, you wouldn't do it. That's just too expensive a way to travel. So back to, the 3 little dots at the bottom there. We've got Philadelphia and what's going to become sort of the Baltimore, Washington area, and New York. New York is we'll just go boop, is on the Hudson, and that is one of the best natural entrances into the interior. It allowed New York right away to, and that's when the Dutch had it. They could trade with the Iroquois up that. Philadelphia, not so much. The Baltimore, Washington area, the Potomac, strangely actually was useful for getting closer to the interior. And then the other dot is an outpost called Duquesne that the French built that would later become Pittsburgh. And that, if any of you were here a few months ago, we did the talk on the Northwest Territories. That came into play because George Washington was going to try to capture that, and he actually captured several French soldiers, and unfortunately they were killed by troops under Washington's control, Native Americans, and that set off the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War here. Then during part of that, Washington led a group of a British army under Braddock to recapture Duquesne, and they were really soundly defeated in one of the worst defeats the British had. So interesting bit of history, but it's that connection that's going to be important down there, because we're looking at different ways of getting to the interior. So this is it's called a road, but it wasn't really a road. It was a improved path, I guess. They said wagons couldn't really survive on it. So in the early 1700s, this is how you could get into the interior. And this was really a migration trail more than it was a trade trail. You could, if you were farming, you could maybe get, you're not going to take crops from Lexington and get them back to Philadelphia on this. But at the time, Philadelphia is the largest city in the US, or it wasn't US then, largest city in North America, and boats were coming in there, and people who wanted to migrate were getting on this trail. So you can grow corn on the frontier, but what can you do with corn? There's no way you're going to put it in a Voyager canoe. You're not going to carry it over the Appalachians. How are you going to make money with your corn?
Booze.
2 things. Well, yes. Your hogs can run around and survive in the woods, and then you can feed them some of the corn you're growing, and they can walk to market. You might convince them to do that. And if you take your corn and you distill it, you ferment it and distill it, that somebody will come and pick that up and pay you for it. So that tends to travel pretty well. So the economy, the early pioneer economy was based on, when you're a kid and you're reading, Washington had to face down the Whiskey Rebellion, and you're like, what's a whiskey rebellion, Well, it's because that was what the economy was based on. And when they started taxing it, it ticked them off. So we've got the French, who really have a way better way of getting to the interior than the English colonies do. So just a little reminder of that. And we've got another industry that's you're not gonna load this on canoes, right? The white pine lumbering started sort of in the St. Lawrence Valley. It started in Maine. At first, lumber was a byproduct of people clearing land for farming. And if you're close to the city, okay, you can bring fairly heavy stuff in. But if you're going to do lumber as a product, it's got to float because there's no way to take, oak and drag it across the Appalachians, right? So coincidentally, there were these massive pine forests, just the wood density is greater than any of the deciduous forests. They'd been there for centuries. And I mean, this is not an unusual photo. You can see how huge those trees are, how close together they are. I mean, it's just massive amounts of wood. And so they began in Maine cutting it down. The British became very dependent on North American lumber. It's actually one of the things that affected their ability to, for their end of the Revolutionary War, because they were cut off from American lumber and other forest supplies. So their navy was struggling to supply their army. But the big thing to take away is there was a ton of lumber in the Great Lakes region, but it wasn't really accessible at this point. Now, on the northern side of the Great Lakes, the Canadians, after Britain, primarily after Quebec falls in 1759, and then the treaty that ends the 7 Years' War, Quebec is given to Britain. So it's now no longer, the people who live there is French speaking, but then there's an overlay of British administration, British troops, and British government. And the trade, the lumber trade that the British are into is this squared timber thing. So this was done for export. It's not done to be used, but these massive trees were cut into these little square things. So a huge amount of waste, but it was done so that they could pack it neatly in ships and then sail it across the Atlantic. So here is, oops, I backed up. There we go. That's Quebec Harbor, and that's squared lumber waiting to get put on ships. So, and that industry, after the Great Lakes starts opening up, gets transferred, and they start on the northern side, primarily on the Canadian side, there's a squared timber business. And then on the American side, it becomes a sawn lumber. So we've got on the American side sawmills that'll cut dimensional lumber. And on the north side, they use axes and cut it into these big cubes. Okay, so back to, if you can see where we're looking at, how to get to the interior. We've got the, you can see the Cumberland, you leave Cumberland and this Braddock's Road, that was the road that Braddock was building with Washington at the head. They got almost up to Fort Duquesne when the British were routed. And then later, of course, that Forbes Road was built to capture it later in the 7 Years' War. But anyway, you can see how difficult it is to get from the Atlantic up to the Great Lakes region. And this sort of Braddock's Road becomes sort of the beginning of what will become the National Highway, also called the Cumberland Road. But don't confuse that with that earlier trail that went to the Cumberland Gap. So there's a Cumberland Gap, and that was like south in like Kentucky, but the Cumberland, Maryland is the beginning of this Braddock's Road, which becomes a national road. So this is how one way to get to the interior. And this was funded. Thomas Jefferson was president and wanted this funded because what did he just acquire? Louisiana Purchase, right. So now there's a real reason to go west, right? And this got money, and over 30 years, they spent almost as much as the Erie Canal cost, but that was over 30 years. It was never funded all at once. The road made it to Wheeling, Virginia in 1818. So that was after the War of 1812, which we're going to get back to. Anyway, this is kind of fun. This is 10 years later than our canal time, but this is the first time that road crosses the Ohio. So before, you have to get there, take a boat across, and then resume that road, right? So it's very useful getting to the Ohio because that gets you down to the interior. And then the rest of the road helps settle the Midwest. And this is another shot. This bridge still exists. It's a pedestrian bridge now, but pretty good for close to 200 years. Okay, so we've got our little drainage map. We've got the Hudson and the Potomac. And these little red dots are things that happened during the War of 1812. So that was part of the greater Napoleonic conflicts. That's what's going on in Europe. But, you know, the US loses control of Chicago to the Native Americans. Detroit is captured by the British. Mackinac's captured. A little light, the U.S. manages to defeat a British naval squadron on Lake Erie, the Battle of Lake Erie at Put-in Bay. So things are kind of mixed on Lake Ontario, and there's a little dot, I don't know if you can see on Lake Champlain, where in between the Hudson and the Richelieu River, that's like a highway that the U.S. was, well, before it was the U.S., the French came down to during the 7 Years' War. The British came down during the American Revolution, and they came down again in the War of 1812. And so that was the Battle of Lake Champlain, and the U.S. held them off. So, which it shows you how that corridor was extremely useful for getting north and south, but also how important it was that it's been a repeated avenue for invasion. So here we are back to this map. So Presque Isle was the site of Americans building boats during the War of 1812. That's where their shipbuilding was. And so to get cannon, because you can make a boat out of wood and stuff, but to get like rope and sails and cannon, that stuff had to go up this sort of Braddock's Road, which was now the National Road. And then you'd go up the Allegheny River, which goes to that Fort Machault. And then the Fort Le Boeuf, that's on the French River. And then you had to drag stuff overland to Presque Isle. And that's where the Americans had their big shipbuilding operation. So there was an arms race during the War of 1812 between the British North American, they weren't Canadians yet, and the Americans. And if anything, should have gotten the federal government interested in funding something like the Erie Canal, it would have been how difficult it was to support defending the frontier. So interestingly, that didn't, they didn't spend the money. The federal government opted not to, but the Canadians would go on to do a lot of improvements because of the battles that occurred in the interior. So this brings us to New York Governor DeWitt Clinton. He's the guy who's going to create the Erie Canal. DeWitt is his mother's maiden name. She was Dutch, the sort of landed gentry that were, there for 100 years already, or 200 years. And his father was an American general during the American Revolution. So pretty good pedigree. And he runs for governor of New York on the platform of building the Erie Canal. So the little picture in the sort of in the background is when they opened the Erie Canal 200 years ago, this October 26th. He had a barrel of Lake Erie water, and that he symbolically poured it into the harbor at New York. So opening the canal system. So and there's another fun thing. Not too many people got their faces on a $1,000 note. Probably won't take that at the 7-Eleven now. Okay, so the Erie Canal was proposed as early as 1768. It didn't get funding, and we talked about how it was funded in this state and private way. They began building it, July 4th, 1817. And they started at Rome, New York. They did a middle section between Rome and Utica because that was the easiest to build. And one of the reasons they did that was they could start making money on it. Any section that was open was making, the demand was so great. One of the reasons it got paid off in 10 years is that as it was incrementally being opened, those sections were being used. So then, within 10 years of its completion, they had to enlarge it and made a bigger one. And it, in part, took over the old canal, and other parts, they changed the course. And then later on, there was the Erie Barge Canal, which was massive for much larger ships, or boats, I should say. Okay, so the total cost at the time, $7 million. And so 230 million in today's dollars. It's actually kind of a bargain. You can't build a mile of expressway for, of course, they weren't paying guys a lot, even in those days. So we talked about this. The manual laborers were 37 cents a day. Anyway, then by the time they stopped charging for tolls in 1882, they had made over 121 million. And they stopped taking tolls. The canal kept functioning, but the competition with other forms of transportation was so great. If they added the tolls to it, and the local, tell them I'm not in, okay? The local economy was already kind of dependent on the canal. So they just decided to stop allowing it to sort of limp along. All right, so going from $100 a ton down to $10 a ton. And then with the expansion 10 years later, it got as low as $4 a ton for moving goods. So it just, the economic, it was, well, the demand is one thing, but this is the cost of, what it took. So it allowed things that would never have been transported before to now be affordable. You could ship stuff, So here's a nice, we used to call them bumpy wall maps. Shows the, and I really want to run over and point, but since our friends at home won't see that. So you've got the Hudson River coming up, and then the Mohawk River is that line. And so when the Appalachians were being formed, there was a river that kept eroding. So it eroded as the mountains rose, and so it allowed this sort of gap to form. And then later the glaciers came, and there was glacial meltwater that followed those trails. So it wasn't canals are usually built on the path of least resistance. And you can see that's like a great place to build a canal if you're going to build one. And then it traveled along the edge. You see the Finger Lakes coming down, so it kind of traveled along that. And then when it got to, and here we've got the Niagara River, it sort of dips into, gets over that Niagara escarpment at a place called Lockport, which isn't too far from where it's going to end up at Towanda and Buffalo. So here we go. It 363 miles. So at that time, 3 tons. Of course, they kept as they enlarged the canal, the boats got bigger. So if you think about a shipping container, 8 by 8 by 40, that's less. So the barges were carrying about half again as much as a shipping container could carry. So 1.5 shipping containers. And there's a nice little map showing all the connections. Building a canal becomes pretty complicated as the waterway. One of the things you want to do is keep it consistent. So, and it was sort of shaped where it was wide at the 40 feet wide, and then it tapered in a bit to 28 feet at the bottom and only 4 feet deep. So it wasn't really, but then the enlargement, practically doubles, more than doubled the volume, but, and there's a nice little scenic picture of going along. So typically it wound along the Mohawk River. At times it would be above it, at times it'd be the same height. So that's in order for the canal to go up or down, they would have to build locks, which would be filled by the upper, water's coming in. It's allowed, the upper body of water will fill the lock behind closed doors, so a boat will rise and then it'll be able to match the height of the higher body. And then in reverse, you go into a lock and then close it at the upstream side, and then you let the water out, and then you're at the level of the lower. Does that make sense? It's a lot easier to see it in a picture, I think. All right, we'll just go back to laborers here. Very, very brutal work. So interestingly, there were 9,000 people employed, but there were many, many more people who were hired by contractors. So the Canal Authority wouldn't pay them directly. They would hire a contractor to, remove this much material. And there were many recent immigrants were in the first canal was primarily dug by Irish labor. By the time the barge canal was built in the 1890s, it's Italian labor, because that's who was immigrating. They would, I'm pretty sure the whiskey that was supplied to them was taken out of their wages, because that's how they did things. But it's interesting that they gave them a fairly large amount, and they gave it to them fairly regularly. And I think that kept them from wandering off site. And maybe not feeling the pain as much. So people made a little more if they had higher skills. And that's again, the photographs are typically later, obviously, because there wasn't a lot of photography in the 1820s. And here's working on a lock. So all the locks were made of stone, even the first go around. And you can see it's leaking where it's being blocked on the back. So oh yeah, and I think it was mixed. I think they would do parallel cuts, but they would also enlarge existing areas. Because when they did the first enlargement, it was largely the original structures. But when they did the barge canal, it was kind of its own thing. So, but remember, there's a whole winter season where you can work on stuff because there's nothing going on. So it's not like you have to shut it down. If you can get work done over the winter, you can do it without disrupting the travel. And that's, of course, another drawback that canals have in the Northern Hemisphere is, you don't want your cargo of perishables stuck frozen in a barge in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York. So that this is, there's several connector canals were built also, and so you'll see some of those. I was shocked that it's easier to read this after I blew it up than when I had it on my computer. But what I like is that top one shows you the profile where it starts way at the end. It's at Troy, which is just north of Albany, and it's virtually at sea level. It's maybe 2 or 3 feet where they've got the Hudson River. It gets dammed there and is raised a bit, and then it works its way up, and then it's another 560 feet up when it gets to Lake Erie. So, but over 300 miles, although the biggest jump is when it gets to, you can see it right there. That stair step is where it gets the last hurdle over the Niagara Escarpment. So not the full Niagara Escarpment like you'd have at Niagara Falls, because it's worked its way up a little bit before that. Right. Yes, we're going to get to that slide. I don't remember. It's like 83, I think. Yeah. So the Champlain Canal was built at the same time. It was actually opened slightly before the Erie Canal. And again, it starts at almost the same point. It kind of, instead of following at Troy, instead of going that way up the Mohawk, it's going up along the Hudson and then gets to Lake Champlain. And there again, we could show you where that is. Okay, 83 stone locks. And what's even more interesting are the aqueducts, because as the canal is going along, it can't follow the contours. It's got to like go over other rivers at times. So, and also, some of these forms that we're talking about, locks and aqueducts, you can see these a few miles south of here, southwest on the old Illinois and Michigan Canal. There are aqueducts still up there at just near Morris. There's the Au Sable Aqueduct, and there's a really nice lock tender house in Shanahan. So it's something to do on a nice weekend, drive out there and check out these things. And here is a picture of an aqueduct. You can see you have to like make a turn across. So that bridge is the canal going over the river. All built by stone. And places where it had to cut into the Niagara Escarpment as it's traveling. There's another aqueduct. Now, this could be since it's a photograph, this could be the second barge canal, the enlarged canal over that might be next to it. That might be the original. And then the second one is the bigger one. Yeah.
Where did they?
As close as possible to where they're. Yeah. Although they had a canal, so they could move stuff. So that helped, but you tried to locally source stuff if you could. That's, yeah. And the Niagara Dolomite is actually a very, it's a limestone, but because it's not going to dissolve, it's a good building material. Almost all of our sidewalks and everything, all the big quarries are into that. Because we have that underneath our, when you go southwest along well, it's where the Illinois Michigan Canal is, but like the Stevenson and there are all those quarries. Well, that's where the glacial meltwaters behind Lake Chicago blasted through and just, kind of eroded down to that dolomite. And it's all exposed there. So the quarries were like, oh, yeah. The huge one that you drive over, like in Lansing, Illinois. So that's in the Niagara Escarpment. So you're walking on that in the sidewalks and driving on it and an old fossil reef from like 320 million years ago. And there's the end, Tonawanda, and then Buffalo is further along here. So this is they stopped collecting tolls because we talked about that, but that structure was the mechanism for weighing barges. So at the beginning of the year, they'd weigh everyone's barge, and then when you filled it up, you'd have to stop, and they would charge you for how much stuff you were moving. So the first, I mean, they built those later. The first go round, they actually just had a chamber where the water level was marked. So when your boat came in, it displaced more water, and they were. So this is that stair step series of locks going up the final stretch of the Niagara Escarpment. And here's a photo of it. And looking down. And that's just the evolution of canal boats, at which, as they increased the size, they were able to haul more stuff. So, yes. Oh, I'm not sure. It's not. It doesn't take that long because it's just you're waiting for the lock to fill. So I would say, having been behind locks, seems like it's half an hour maybe because you're just, the water's just filling up. You're just holding on to ropes, hoping your craft doesn't bounce around too much if it's turbulent and stuff. And those things were generally sized to fit the lock. They maxed the canal boats so they just rode up. But does anybody else have a clue as to how long the locking took? I don't think it was excessive. The mules were generally carrying dragging the boats at about 4 miles an hour. So, and here we have. So if you notice the guy, he's using an intercom system there. What's interesting about this is we're actually seeing 2 boats passing. So the horses in the foreground are pulling the barge behind. They're coming this way. And those mules are pulling that one. So they had to do the sort of elaborate thing when they were passing of letting your ropes go over the inner boat. Now, apparently, people would get into fights when that wasn't done right. So sometimes the jolly boatmen weren't that jolly, I guess. But apparently nobody's getting into a fist fight here and passing smoothly. Going, and this turned out fuzzier than I intended, but so this is a packet boat for passengers, and clearly they've got horses carrying the passengers as opposed to mules. So the horses probably went faster and they needed 3 of them. And lumber becomes a commodity. So that white pine is now being harvested on the Great Lakes and milled, and you can see it's getting stacked, and that barge is just packed with lumber. Any idea what's in this? This is apples. Yeah. Not yet, just the apples. Hasn't been made into cider yet. But I imagine, there's just no way that they would have carried apples if they had to even put it in a cart. What it would maybe 30 or 40 miles from where they're grown, but now it's going hundreds of miles. So just the cost of freight just change. So now somebody can have a farm in Ohio and grow apples that are eaten in New York. Oh, yeah, they're on the top of a relaxing journey. So he's got his intercom going. So part of that is because, if you've got a guy leading the mules, or in this case, horses, it's a long way away. So how are you going to tell them it's time to pull over or whatever? Or there's another boat down there, so looks like they're ahead. So on a boring ride, you might get out and walk because it's only 4 miles an hour. But when it's time to get back in, you're going to have to wait for a bridge and jump. So apparently this was common enough for somebody to bother doing an engraving about it. So. There's a later, you can see how long ahead the horses are on this. And there's an advertisement for the passenger service. So the Canadians weren't going to just sit still while the Americans built the Erie Canal. They started doing improvements themselves. There were a series of rapids just outside Montreal, which were very dangerous. In fact, that's Joliet lost his maps and his whole crew there, only survived himself barely. So there's this whole island is Montreal now, but originally it was just on that end. Anyway, they cut a canal across the corner, bypassing most of those rapids, and that was 1821. So it's in our time frame. The Welland Canal was a more serious contender for competing with the Erie Canal, because this actually connects Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. So it is getting over that Niagara escarpment. It's connecting the upper lakes to the lower lake. Now, their 150,000 funding they needed to come up with more money before they were finished. And their plans changed a few times in the middle of building it. It was only done with wooden locks. It was a tenth as long, 27 miles. But it was a little bigger because they were trying to get some of the schooners through as opposed to canal boats. So one of the drawbacks of a canal is you've got whatever ship you've brought the goods to, you've got to unpack it, put it in a canal boat, goes through the canal, unpacked, and put in another ship. So that 2 steps is an expense. So by having something that some of the schooners could fit, you didn't have to do that unpacking stuff. Then they built 2 other canals, or I should say 3. The Chambly way at the end by Montreal connects the same Lake Champlain waterway that the Erie Canal, Champlain Canal connected to. So now so that's not as much competition as cooperation. So now you can go from the St. Lawrence, just outside of Montreal, all the way down to New York by connecting those 2 canals through Lake Champlain. The canal that goes south of Ottawa is connecting the Ottawa River down to Lake Ontario. That's the Rideau Canal. And then that really messy thing, the Brent-Severn Waterway, it was begun in 1833, but I don't think it was finished for a long time. I forget exactly when, but it took a while. And particularly the Rideau Canal was that was done by the British because they were worried about maintaining access in case the Americans invaded again. They wanted a way of bypassing some of the the possessions and the St. Lawrence. Because you can see like Sackett Harbor and the U.S. could close off parts of that. So now, because so much money was made with the Erie Canal, as people started moving westward, everybody thought, man, a canal, I'm going to make a lot of money. Now, most of those went bust and people did not make money because it's all good, but they're not actually connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. That's been done, right? So the other canals, may have, like going from Erie down to Ohio, the Ohio River. I mean, that's probably useful. And that's, you can, because the Ohio is such a huge artery. And then the Toledo down to Evansville. So that's kind of along the Maumee River and then the Wabash. And Chicago invested in the Illinois and Michigan Canal. And that ended up not really making much money either. So although it was an important canal for Chicago, and it was important that in creating what would become Chicago, it wasn't quite as key as it could have been. And there are some reasons besides the Erie Canal being exactly in the right place at the right time. It was bad timing for these other canals because something else had its birthday this year also. The first regularly scheduled railroad was 200 years this year. So same as the Erie Canal. So the canal's time was running out with steam engines and railroads. Now it would take a long time before this could really compete, carrying the tonnage a canal could, but you can lay down track and get a lot quicker and hit a lot more areas, and the coverage can be a lot deeper. So some interesting things to look at before and after the Erie Canal. In before the American Revolution, that top line are the four biggest cities in what would become the United States. Philadelphia, by far the biggest, followed by New York, Boston, and Charleston. Just for reference, Quebec was at 10,000, not too far, it would have been the fifth. Montreal was just 500 people. New Orleans in 1803, 8,000. I mean, it's pretty substantial. Why do we use 1803? That's when it becomes part of the United States, right? St. Louis also, really more than Montreal, because that Mississippi River trade had been developed by the French. They were using the Mississippi to supply their islands. They didn't get Haiti right away, but they had islands in the Caribbean where they were growing sugar and making money. And Quebec was costing them money, but they could grow wheat in Illinois, ship it down the Mississippi, and feed the slaves on the plantations growing sugar and make money that way. So Illinois was part of this weird trade situation. The other importance that New Orleans had to the French was it was a freshwater port. To not get into the weeds too much, saltwater on wooden ships, there's a mollusk that eats them from the inside, from the outside in, and it's called teredos, shipworms. And you need to get ships out of saltwater and into freshwater to control that. So the French wanted a big freshwater port. So connecting it with where they could grow crops to supply the islands and then have a place where their ships could get repaired. So that's what New Orleans was about at that time. So it becomes part of the United States by 1820. So just before the canal is fully open, New York has really increased its size. Philadelphia, I mean, everything's grown. New Orleans has grown. Montreal has overtaken Quebec because it's connected to the interior. And Toronto now has a population. Of course, Chicago, not so much. Its time is coming, but slowly. And the Erie Canal is the impetus that allows Chicago to grow, but not quite so soon. And then just to go down to 1840, New York City is still growing rapidly. New Orleans is huge amount of growth. Montreal and Quebec are not. They're increasing, but not as much. 1860 is interesting in that Philadelphia, although it's nowhere near overtaking New York, has a real burst. It's like 5 times the population had 20 years before. So we're shifting from, we're getting into the interior is allowing agriculture and trade. But when we get into the steam and energy being used for manufacturing, we're getting into an industrial economy. And Philadelphia has got anthracite coal for one thing. It's got access to that and labor, and Philadelphia becomes a big manufacturing hub, and Pennsylvania. So this is after this is when Fort Dearborn was rebuilt. So Chicago, which by the 1890s would become the largest, port, possibly in the world, it is not a natural harbor. This is the lakefront. It's a sandbar with a meandering river behind it. There's nothing that says this is where you should bring a lot of boats to. So there's no natural attributes except location. And it is on this is our connection to the Great Lakes. So that's a scheme of what an early drawing of Chicago. You can see the soldiers tried to cut a canal through the sandbar to make Chicago a little more navigable. So ships had to come, stand off in the waves, and then small boats would have to run supplies in because there was no way to dock or bring a boat into Chicago. Another thing to note, that shoreline Lake Michigan is about where Michigan Avenue is. So everything to the east has been filled in. So here's where Chicago starts overtaking St. Louis. So in 1860, just before the Civil War, St. Louis is the second largest port in the country. New York is the first. But then 40 years later, or 50 years later, Chicago is now the busiest port, overtaking New York even. That's population. So St. Louis could have been Chicago, but the Erie Canal, having that direct connection to the Great Lakes, overtook the natural Mississippi connection. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas, who gets a bad rap for those, what he did though is he convinced Congress to make Chicago the rail center. And if St. Louis had been the rail center, which was the other possibility, these numbers wouldn't be the same. It was that connection between the Great Lakes and the rails that allowed Chicago to grow as much as it did. And that sort of, the Erie Canal is what kind of led to Chicago being in that position. Now, wrapping it up, the St. Lawrence Seaway. So that didn't, to actually navigate a full ship from the Great Lakes to the ocean wasn't really finished until 1959. So it was, all those other things were sort of hodgepodge or converting to canals. And even now, the St. Lawrence is not capable of carrying 90% of the ocean-going ships. Now, when it was built, it would do better, you know, it was, but ship sizes have gone, increased so much recently. So, anyway, ta-da.
Please state the content of the question so our people at home.
Sure.
It seems like you have the railway, right? It goes east-west because the Great Lakes. It creates like a natural border. And then you have, the Erie Canal. It seems like there's a lot of like, it's crosshairs with Chicago is. Because we're like the
Right.
Great Lakes, we're like, I don't know.
So the question, or is almost like an observation, the Great Lakes, which is our water connection, is also, it forces it to be a land connection because you can't go through them. And it's interesting, you know, the Canadian, most of their rail traffic does not go over the Great Lakes. It comes through the Chicago area. So that, which is to your point, that one of the reasons Chicago is where it's at is that all that traffic has to go south of the Great Lakes. Yeah.
Is that a regular industry already to be building barges, or do they have to be?
They were specially built.
Yeah.
They were built for that purpose. Yeah. No, I think they were more built to fit the locks. They could not be any bigger than those locks. And it wouldn't make any sense to build it smaller because you want to maximize each trip. So they were like probably churned out to be, now the things that were a little different were the passenger one. I mean, the passenger boats were one kind of boat and the strictly freight was another. But I think they pretty much stuck to, you know, and they were very simple. Right.
Yeah. Like, you know, and getting longer, it makes sense to have them being built at the head of the canal. Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, where were the canal boats built? And I would say they were probably built where the wood was. Because that would be so much easier to, whatever close to the canal place you could build boats would be. Now, before the canal was completely open, the middle section was open. So they would have built those boats in the middle section. But, you know, there's a lot of pine and it's gone now. Yes.
Syracuse, where Erie Canal that has the last surviving weight lock in the Erie Canal system. So they would weight both there and charging the toll based on what kind of cargo you had, how much it weighed, and how far you were. So I was kind of wondering, did most canal boat captains carry cargo from end to end, from Buckwood all the way to or vice versa? Which would be the most total you could possibly pay, or would they try to unload cargo along the way and then buy other cargo to pay less? What would be strategy?
The question is, was most of the cargo through the system or was it intermittent? And I think it's a combination. And I think there were guys who were set up to do, you know, like milk runs, and there were other boats that were loading up at one end and going the whole way. And it would just, you know, so it would, yeah, that would be my guess as to how primarily that ran. I'll get to you next.
A little bit of
information about living or these canal people were going the distance or long distance. Did they live on the boats? Is it common to, I mean, did they cook on the
Yeah,
boats? Did
yeah.
they-
Yeah,
they-
especially the, yeah.
So they had actual living.
Oh, yeah, sorry. The question was, did crews live on the boats? And that was, I think, the case. Certainly on the main crew, I'm pretty, we were just talking about this earlier. I think the kid who did the mules probably was local. He probably stuck with the mules. And my guess is he'd go out, they'd pick up another kid and another crew of mules, and then that kid would pick up another boat so that he would end up being home more often than not. So, and the mules would be home. Right. Yeah. And they would know where that distance was. They would stop. That's what I've seen, yes. So this, oh, right. A packet boat refers primarily to a passenger boat. That's what I've heard it. Oh, mail? Okay. But probably people in mail. Yeah. When did mules get phased out? I think it would certainly by the time that larger barge canal, I think the second go round when they enlarged it in the 1835, that was still mules. But when they moved to the barge canal, they got rid of the towpath and everything. So, yeah, poor mules. Yeah.
Is there a place where there's a barge boat on display as a museum?
Okay, so the question is there a place where there is a boat on display? Now, there's a replica boat, I think in Utica, but it's I forget what it is, like 1/5 scale, but it would give you an idea of what it was like. And you were just, Walter, you were just down at the Erie Canal. Did they have a boat on display?
Just water, take people on cruises. But again, this is on.
But that's probably like a modern
Yeah.
fixed up thing that isn't going to sink and stuff. Yeah. Yeah. You got to remember that these canal boats are really long and so they're not going to be useful anywhere but the canal. So.
Just to offside, whatever, you mentioned that a lot of Irish worked on the canal and a lot of Italians worked on the canal. And the city of Buffalo is probably 33% Irish, 33% Italian, and 33% whatever. And I just really have always found it funny that like everybody I'm Irish, everybody in my family's married. So whatever gets.
They're both Catholics, so it's, you had another question, sir?
Steam.
Were
they built in newer, larger boats?
I think it was the transition between, okay, so when did steam take over? Well, the first place where steam was important was at the ends because these barges could get towed. So you could tow a bunch of barges out to Buffalo and load it on ships, or the ships could could only really sail into Buffalo. But once you had steam ships, those could travel up and meet the canal boats. So steam was more useful on the ends initially because you had to think those canal boats, they're not going fast anyway. And they're narrow but yeah, by the time it's now the barge canal at the end, that would have been steam. And
Bill, I apologize for not asking a question, but giving an anecdote. When the
Okay.
Viking came to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, she was going through the Erie Canal and she accidentally sunk her steamboat tug. And so that's, and if you want to see the Viking, she's in Geneva now, but that's how heavy she was. She just ran over her own tugboat and sunk it.
So there's a story of a Viking raid on a steamship on the Erie Canal for those at home. No, that it had to do with the anecdote was about the Norwegians built a replica of, I don't know, the Godstack ship or something they had found. And they sailed it to North America for the World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. Grant, you got a question?
No, another
Oh.
anecdote or
Okay.
whatever. If anybody would like to buy a canal boat and a mule, the Illinois Michigan Canal Corridor Association is privatizing theirs, as we have down in Boris.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So apparently the comment is that if you want to buy a canal boat and a mule to go with it, it's going to become available down in Morris, Illinois. Now, we might be able to get some kind of bond issue and go into business, huh?
I went Sal Peru on that. Rebecca was our mule skinner and the mule was named Mole. So I think that may be what you're talking.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Two mules, Larry and Bo. Larry.
Maybe it was Larry. I can't remember.
No, there was still.
It was a highlight of my life.
You did get the mule's consent that he wasn't being abused. They enjoyed his line of work. Yeah.
well, mules apparently will let you know if they're not happy, and they will not go beyond their expectations. So, but they will work hard in those parameters. Any other? Yeah.
Mule skinner came from the boys who were leading the mules, and then they would whip the mule. It was not.
Okay. So for those at home, the kids that drove the mules got called mule skinners because they were whipping the mules.
As heard in the Dolly Parton song, right? So we've got about time for one more question. If we have one in the room.
Any at-home questions?
No at-home questions, although I can certainly make one up.
Well, is Mary Ann still on? She was supposed to be. All right. Our board members are supposed to watch the whole show, you know.
Similar accent. Chicago.
It's because the person from Buffalo has lived here longer.
Well, you know, Madeline, why don't you relay it? Because that's your anecdote and you seem, there's a, oh, okay. Well, apparently there are linguistic similarities between the accent in Buffalo and the accent in Chicago. So. And understandable by everybody, unlike many people who purport to speak English from parts. Again, thank you all for being here. So, and on the 26th, have some whiskey in honor of the people who built the canal.